welcome everyone who's watching from Secular Eclectic Academic Homeschoolers. My name is Lindsay Sedano and I'm so excited to be here with you today. As I record this from my history corner, in my house, I think we're on day 57 of quarantine, so that's been interesting. I hope that you're doing okay as you're watching this. Hope you're having a fun time maybe thinking about planning for next year's homeschool year. I am a very big planner, so I think the hardest part for me has been that we don't know what's going on. We can't plan vacations, we can't plan field trips, we're not really sure. So that's been an invitation to me to try to take life a little more day to day, if possible, but it is definitely hard for me. So I'm excited to be here and talk to you about planning for next year's homeschool because I like thinking about the future right now. So I'm going to switch over to my slides, and with that, we'll get started. I know we have a mix of folks listening in today, where there might be some experienced homeschoolers, veterans who've been doing this for years, maybe some people who are planning to get started on homeschooling and now their kids are just about old enough. And then we also might have some surprise homeschoolers who maybe didn't originally intend to look into homeschooling, but who are now thinking maybe I'll take my child's education into my own hands, just given what's going on in the world right now. So welcome to everyone, no matter what situation you might be in. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. I write for Pandia Press, a publisher of history and science curriculum. And I was the development editor on History Quest Early Times, which just came out last September, and that's a chapter book. It has a narrative history of ancient times and also a time travel element to it. I was the co-author of the study guide that goes along with History Quest Early Times, and that's where you'd find the crafts and recipes, the map work, discussion questions, all that good stuff, and literature components as well. I worked on Pandia's free pandemic unit study that just came out, and that's downloadable completely for free from Pandia's website. And I also am the author of upcoming History Quest Middle Times, which covers the Middle Ages, kind of picks up where History Quest Early Times had left off, and the study guide that goes along with that one. Again, that's the recipes and the maps and discussion questions and all that good stuff. I have 3 kids, and I started homeschooling the oldest, that's the guy standing there with the pretzel, the giant pretzel, when he was really, really little. So he's been homeschooled the entire time. He's now in high school and taller than me, which is hard to believe. And I put in a couple pictures of a couple things that I've really enjoyed about homeschooling, besides the ability to, really personalize what you're doing and to teach the subjects that you and your child are interested in and to go at your own pace. Besides all of those just regular benefits of homeschooling, we've been able to travel quite a bit because we can go to places like Disney World or wherever we want to go when everyone else is in school, which has been really, really nice. And then the other thing kind of specific to our family is that my oldest son and I are both very interested in theater, and we've been able to perform quite a bit, which I know kids who go to regular school do that as well. And it's amazing because you're out very late, you're out till 11:30 at night rehearsing, and then you're getting up and going to school in the morning. So being a homeschooler has been a huge advantage, and actually quite a few of the people we perform with are also homeschoolers. From various backgrounds. So that's been wonderful to be able to pursue that hobby while also having some flexibility. Okay, so let's jump in here. One of the things I'd like to do is maybe give at least my answers to some of the questions that I see all the time. And one of them is, should I even teach history to the youngest kids? Don't they just teach that social studies in school? Why should I teach history? And if you are thinking that, you are right. History is really not covered very much in public school, especially at the younger ages. They do quite a bit when you get to like high school. But if you're in elementary school, you're not going to be getting a lot of history in public schools. The reason for that is history does not appear on standardized tests, and the teachers are under quite a bit of pressure to get those scores up. So they're going to be focusing on math and reading quite a bit, just to make sure that they're hitting those benchmarks that they need to worry about. And that makes sense. When you do see history in public school, often it's connected to holidays. It's Martin Luther King week. Let's study him for a little bit out of context, really. So your child, if they go to public school, might come home and they'll know a little bit about Martin Luther King, but they don't know anything necessarily that came before him, leading up to him. So it's a little bit out of context. So they hit it a little bit, but not a ton. However, I'm going to argue that learning the foundations of history, especially the fun stuff at a young age, can really give you an advantage later, because it's not all brand new to you when you show up in 9th grade and all of a sudden you need to know about ancient history. So besides the fact that learning history at a very young age can be fun and engaging and teach you a lot about the world, it can also be a little bit lucrative. In our family this year, my 15-year-old was actually able to test out of about 15 social sciences college credits alone, and that's just in history and social sciences. And though that and math are probably his two best subjects, so that's where he's really focused. But he's, tested out of an entire semester of college of this content, and I really do think that he wouldn't have been able to do that at age 15 if he hadn't started, studying these same topics when he was a little kid. So when they're asking him questions about, Akhenaten, the pharaoh from Egypt, he's known that name for 9 or 10 years. It's not something that's new to him. So even though he didn't know it at a college level when he was 6 or 7 years old, he certainly does now. So I do think that's an extra benefit if you're looking ahead at the high cost of college. You may be able to test out of some of that and start at an older year. Maybe start as a sophomore or a junior, or even some people are starting as seniors or finishing a bachelor's degree in high school, just based on the knowledge that they've accumulated throughout all these years of homeschooling. So how are we going to do this? Who do we cover? What do we need to talk about? What time periods? What locations? We know that these kids are really smart. They can and do understand stories from long ago and far away. And that's going to be true as long as they're told in language that kids can understand, and if possible, using connections to each other and to modern life. I'll give you an example. The Byzantine Empire installed an optical telegraph warning system so that they could tell when attackers were on the way and then send a message to all the other watchtowers that trouble was coming. And that's not too hard to understand, but if you go ahead and link that to the alerts that we get, and in modern times when there's a storm coming, all of our phones will start beeping and tell us that there's a storm warning or a lightning watch or whatever it is. And that's something that kids are familiar with, so they can say, oh yeah, that's kind of the same thing. They didn't have iPhones, they didn't have cell phone technology, but they did build this big optical telegraph system. So even a very long time ago, they were sending out messages almost the same way that we do today. When you first start thinking about teaching history, you might feel like this parent in the middle here, a little confused. You're thinking, oh man, there's all of these different people, places, times, artifacts. There's things I know, things I don't know, things I wish I had studied in school, but maybe my school was a little bit more Eurocentric than I would have liked. And how am I going to include, cultures that I have never studied? And, you have this job as almost a gatekeeper of taking all of this information, kind of everything that ever happened in the history of ever, and funneling it down to your child. So you're the storyteller, you're the gatekeeper, you're in charge. And that's this huge responsibility that I know a lot of us take really seriously. And it is a challenge. So let's look at some of the common questions regarding, how do I distill all of this information into something that's easily digestible for a child and that's going to make sense and work in my homeschool. So let's take a look at that. We'll start with the who of teaching history. This is a question I see a lot. How can I include historically marginalized peoples in my history curriculum while also making sure to cover the content that my child will be expected to know, things that are going to turn up, quote, on the test in the future? And there really are several ways to approach this, but I'll tell you kind of what I've done as I've written History Quest. I always make sure to teach that core content. So, who were the Mongols? How did they get started? Who was Genghis Khan? Who was Kublai Khan? What was life like for people in their empire? What was their effect on history? And oftentimes I'll include most of that core information in the main chapter in History Quest. And then what I'll do in the second part of that chapter, which is the time travel portion, that's where I'm kind of really digging to find who has been forgotten in this story, whose story really needs to be told. So, in that Mongol example, this is like my favorite story from History Quest. I found out about a wrestling champion princess named Kochian, whose name I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly. She was her father's favorite child, and he was one of the leaders. She was raised to be this champion wrestler and really good at all kinds of warfare. Suitors came from all over wanting to marry her, and she made a rule, and this was her rule. She refused to marry any man who couldn't beat her at wrestling. And she just went ahead and beat everybody. So everyone would show up, and she'd just knock them to the ground and always won. And eventually this really good-looking, handsome, rich prince comes along, and she actually really likes him. And everyone, including her parents, is like, would you consider throwing the match just this one time? And she just could not bring herself to do it. She was not going to throw that match. So down he went as well. So what a great story. I just love, hearing about her. And that's someone who, she's never going to appear on the test, as they say. But it's just such a great story worth telling. I love that one. So that's one that I've included of a story of a powerful female character that you're not going to hear about, too often when you're studying the Mongol Empire. But she was there, and there's people like her all over history. They're all over the place that you're able to include if you just dig a little bit. Another question I see quite a bit is, I'd like to use a secular curriculum. How am I going to do that without ever mentioning religion at all when we're talking about history? And the answer is really, you can't. From ancient times all the way to modern times, so many decisions and events and historical figures were influenced by what people believed. Whether it's a cultural thing or, a war, there's just so many that were influenced by religion. So you can kind of, even just try this as a thought exercise. Try explaining to your child why the Egyptians mummified their dead bodies without mentioning their religious beliefs. So you say, okay, they carefully prepared their bodies, turned them into mummies, and this was because, why? It just doesn't make sense without including that they thought that the dead people would need their bodies when they passed into the next life. So if you leave that detail out, the whole thing doesn't make any sense, and it's just really hard to understand. So I think if you want a secular curriculum, the definition of that isn't that, no religion is ever mentioned anywhere in the text. I think a better definition that's going to work for you would be you want a curriculum that doesn't promote one specific or more than one specific religion over others or over none at all, and that doesn't present sort of supernatural events as if they actually happened. So we're only looking at factual events, things that actually happened, and that treats each religion or having no religion whatsoever in just a fact-based way. Here's these people, here's what they believe, this is when this started, this is some of the cultural parts that go along with it. So I don't think you have to completely cut out religion. I don't see how you can. I think it would be really difficult to understand motivations for events without having that in there. So this question is a little bit about the where and when. Where do I start? What order should I go in? Should I study my country's history or only world history? What should I do? And there's so many right answers to this question. I'll tell you what I didn't like about history when I went to public school, especially in elementary school, is that we kind of jumped around all over the place. We might do ancient Egypt 1 month, and then the next month was the American Revolution. So there's no connection between events. You don't see any kind of natural flow of the story from one thing to the next. It was just these units that were really all over the place. And personally, I didn't prefer that. You absolutely can do it that way. I just wasn't a fan of it when I was a kid, I remember. So I wanted to do it a little bit more in order. And you'll see that in the homeschooling community. A lot of people will do maybe an ancients for about a year and then go to the Middle Ages for another year, then hit the early modern period, and then finally the modern period, and maybe then repeat that in middle school as well. And then in high school, possibly going through it a third time, but if not, I think more and more people are using dual credit or taking AP or CLEP classes. So in that case, it might switch up a little bit in high school to prepare for those kind of tests or for those dual credit classes. So that's one way to do it. You also really could do 3 years of world history and 1 year of the history specifically of the country you live in. And it is going to be expected that your child knows your own country's history fairly well, at least, eventually once they get into middle or high school. That's going to be an expectation. So you're going to want to think about including that. And this, just my own personal preference as well, we always start studying history in our family with big history, starting with the Big Bang, just all the way through the beginning of life and dinosaurs and primates and early humans, which I love to study. That's my favorite room of the Field Museum. I love to go in there and look at, all the different types of humans who came before us. And that can be, I think, so hard for the youngest kids to understand. It's hard for me to understand how short of a time people, were around in terms of the history of the earth. So I decided this is not from my curriculum that I wrote. I just did this, for fun on my own last winter. And by the way, this is before toilet paper became an apocalyptic currency. So please don't think I'm wasting my, stash of toilet paper. This was months and months ago when you see this. But we made a toilet paper timeline that starts at the Big Bang and then goes all the way up until now, just so my youngest son could visualize how incredibly short of a time human beings have been around. So this, we had this toilet paper kind of wrapping around our basement. So I'll show you that in a second here.
The Earth, the beginning of the moon, all this time the Earth was alive. And then bacteria, algae live. If we start at the place where bacteria is, we have to go all the way until like the animals lived right there.
So those are the first animals.
Yeah.
That's really far after when the earth started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here are the first animals right there. Here are the first fish, the first bugs, the first reptiles, and the first dinosaurs. So right here are birds and mammals, and there is dinosaurs go extinct, and early primates.
Do you know how to read that word?
Australopithecus.
That's right.
And modern people.
So have modern people been around for a long time?
No.
Oh, it's so amazing that all of human history that we study was just in that one little tiny, end of the toilet paper there. So we had a lot of fun doing that one. The last question here is that, people wonder, what methodology should I be using to teach history? What's effective at the elementary level? And I'm, of course, going to argue that narrative is the best way to do it. Storytelling, simple storytelling, is the best way to, really get that information from your brain to theirs. And there's been a lot of academic, peer-reviewed research to back that up as well. I know Margaret McKeon, Isabel Beck have done a lot of studies in the past on that topic, and especially as it relates to teaching history. They really, tend to conclude that it needs to be presented to students in a simple, coherent narrative style so that they can come up with, see this chain of events happening. So not just this list of facts, but a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and engages you and helps you really see the big picture of what's going on. And as human beings, we're really hardwired for stories. We're just built to like stories. I love this quote from Jonathan Gottschall. We are, as a species, addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. And you know what? Even right before you go to sleep, your child asks for a bedtime story. They don't ask for a bedtime list of facts. So we love them. Kids love them. Grown-ups love them. Everyone does. I know I listen to a lot of history podcasts to just, see what's going on in the world of history scholarship. And whenever somebody starts telling just a really juicy story, I so perk up every single time and pay much more attention, and I just feel so much more engaged when it's told in that story style. So I'd like to actually give you an example. I'm actually going to show you the same information presented two different ways. So the first will be basically the Wikipedia entry on Norse or Viking ships, the long ships that you see here pictured. And then the second version is told in a narrative. It's really the same information, but told in a narrative style. It's kind of a sneak peek from the upcoming History Quest book. And just in case you're getting sick of hearing me talk, I thought I would bring in a guest reader, and I have my son ready to go.
Viking ships were marine vessels of unique structure built by the Vikings during the Viking Age. The boat types were quite varied depending on what the ship was intended for, but they were generally characterized as being slender and flexible boats with symmetrical ends with true keel. They were clinker built, which is the overlapping of planks riveted together. Some might have had a dragon's head or other circular object protruding from the bow and stern for design, although this is only inferred from historical sources. Viking ships were not just used for their military prowess, but also for long-distance trade, exploration, and colonization.
Okay, so that's not bad. It had all the facts. It was a lot of the information you'd want to know about what these ships looked like and how they were built. But it's, a little dry, maybe not going to engage children very well. Of course, you wouldn't go reading Wikipedia entries out loud to your kid anyway. You'd probably be using a textbook if you were going with a more of a just the facts approach. But we just decided, to pull that for this example, so we're not pulling from someone else's textbook here. So here's an example of what you might do if you wanted to tell the story of the Norse ships and Norse shipbuilding from a storytelling standpoint. So I brought in my son once again to go ahead and read kind of a sneak peek excerpt. You'll notice he does not have the book in his hand. This book is not out yet. It is still being finished up, so he only has it on paper, so that's why he doesn't have the actual book. And here he goes.
Oof. Before you can even open your eyes on this history hop, you're about to lose your balance. The floor beneath your feet bucks upwards and knocks you onto your backside. Luckily, you land seated on a large trunk, although its wooden lid is pretty hard. You instinctively thrust your arms behind you and brace yourself. Your whole world is dipping and lurching and leaning. You open your eyes and realize you've just had a rather rude welcome on a Viking longship. You're at sea. The open ocean is magnificent, water stretching toward every horizon. The weather is clear and full of gleaming white sunlight, but it's cold. The salty sea breeze makes your eyes sting. You long for a cozy coat, and you'd really be grateful for gloves. "Here, take this," says a voice. You look up to see a teenage boy with sandy hair and pink cheeks. He holds out a big blanket. "Thanks," you say, wrapping the warm woolen blanket around your shoulders. The boy sits beside you on the trunk. "You took a good tumble there," he says. "You must have just arrived as the wind picked up." He points up to a gigantic red and white striped rectangular sail swollen with wind. Men on the deck are busy wrestling with ropes to control the sail. They must have a destination in mind, and they are fighting the elements to get there. You glance behind you. At the stern, the back of the boat, you see a sailor steering. The helmsman is using all of his strength to pull on a leather strap that turns the starboard oar. The oar on the right side of the ship. Up at the front of the ship, called the bow, another man calls out directions to the rest of the crew. The ship seems to fly across the water. Chilly open air swipes your face and flattens the blanket against your body. At least you found your balance on the trunk. Is this what they mean by getting your sea legs? You hope the worst is over and you won't get seasick. Round yellow and red shields hang on a shield rack that runs along both sides of the ship. An uneasy thought occurs to you. "We're not going plundering, are we? Because I am not allowed to go plundering," you ask the boy sitting next to you. "Oh, yes we are," he says with a wry smile. "I figure we'll loot some monasteries first. Maybe you can snag yourself a big gold jeweled chalice." "What? You didn't sign up for this." "Only joking," says the boy. "We're not on our way to a raid. We're just leaving home in Iceland. In a few days, we'll join up with our friends and family. They started a new settlement in a place called Greenland. I haven't been there, but I've heard it's full of fish." He smiles again, but this time it seems much friendlier. "My name is Torsten, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Torsten," you say, remembering your manners. You're relieved that you won't wind up in the middle of a Viking raid after all. With that fear put to rest, you immediately have questions. "But Vikings did use this kind of ship for raids, right?" "That's true," says Torsten. "My family tells stories of ancestors who stole treasure from Lindisfarne about 200 years ago."
So hopefully you kind of connected with that second reading a little bit better. It had a lot of sensory details. You felt like you were in the story because the way we write History Quest, there's a time travel element where you quote unquote, the kid or the student who's reading the story travel back to the time that you're studying and interact with someone from that time. So you're supposed to feel like you're a little bit more present, like you're really there. And why does narrative style work so well? I think for me, the sensory details are what accomplishes that. The, hearing and seeing, touching, tasting, smelling, all of those parts of the story, they kind of act like magnets that attract names and dates and battles and facts and people and places to them. So if you ask me later, who was the founder of the Mali Empire, I might not remember, but then I say, oh no, I know who it was. It was Sundiata. He's the one who, there's this legendary story about him where he goes and rips a baobab tree right out of the ground and proves how strong he is. So you're just remembering that image of this guy ripping this massive tree out of the ground. That's kind of how I remember his name. So to me, they work very well, really as like a magnetic force that you can attach a fact to in your mind. And another thing I want to mention is, for this age group, for the elementary kids, please do not worry about them memorizing all of these names and dates and facts. That can come later, if it even needs to, depending on what they're going to be pursuing when they get to secondary school. Little 6-year-olds do not need to be able to list every Roman emperor and every pharaoh and what date this battle happened on. They do not need to know that. We're going for a big overview, a big picture look at history. And they're going to remember what has sparked their interest, and that's great. But they don't need to be taking, quizzes and tests on all this. This is really just, I don't know, the only way I can describe it is kind of let the story wash over them, and whatever they hang on to, whatever remains, is what they're going to know for a while. And that's okay, because all of those names and dates and terms and things can come a little bit later on in their academic career. One more thing I want to discuss really quickly is historical fiction and historical literature. And those are not quite the same thing, but you're going to want to probably include both of them in your narrative-based history study. So what's pictured here is actually historical literature. So these are works that were written in those time periods, and then they've been edited and illustrated for children. Gilgamesh the King is such a great series. Beautiful, beautiful illustrations. I know that one is my daughter's favorite one to read. Both my sons love Black Ships Before Troy, and then it has a sequel, The Wanderings of Odysseus. And of course, those are the Iliad and the Odyssey, written for children. Gorgeous illustrations in that one. The Ramayana is so fun. I love that version of it. It's actually done, put together and illustrated by one of the artists from Pixar. So if you're a fan of Pixar movies, that might be a good one for you. So you want to include, historical literature from that time period that you're studying. And then you also want to, if you can, include some historical fiction. And what that is something that was written now, but takes place, in the past. So the time travel portion of History Quest would fit that bill. The Magic Treehouse books would fit that bill. There's other versions of stories that have been written in modern times but take place during the time period that you're studying. I know when I was a kid, I loved those choose your own adventure stories where you get to the bottom of the page and it tells you to make a decision, and then you go to page 83 and fall off a cliff or something. Those were super popular when I was a kid, and I'm sure they are still now, and they still exist, and versions of them do. So you want to include both historical fiction and historical literature if you can. So let's say you're all done with your narrative history. You've read some historical fiction, some historical literature. You feel like you've got pretty good hold on the knowledge there of what you've learned about the culture. What can you do to take it one step further, especially with this age group? I'm a big fan of hands-on projects, if possible. And I do say if possible. You are going to have weeks where there's a dentist appointment and the car broke down and there's all kinds of issues going on and you're just not feeling it and you're not able to do these kinds of projects because they can be a little bit complicated sometimes. And please, please, please don't feel less than or feel like you missed something really, really important if you have to cut out some of your project ideas. It's okay. Nothing bad's going to happen. It's all right. So over here on the next slide, I have a couple of examples of some of the projects we've done in the past year or so. We did a lot of recipes, a lot of cooking. We like to try foods from all over the world, from all different times. We made a board game, we've painted, we've glued things. Building models is a great way to learn about buildings, and even people use that in science quite a bit as well. And so when you do these hands-on projects, just like the sensory details in the narrative, these act a lot like a magnet, and it just attracts facts and things to remember. So when you're asked later, like, what kind of art were the Byzantines famous for? You're like, oh, I made that mosaic. It's mosaic art. That's the answer. I remember doing that. It was kind of hard. So once again, if you're able to, go ahead and add some hands-on activities. I thought I would just give you a quick example These guys are smashing up a clay pot. They're going to turn it into paint using the crushed up, or he's going really fast. I've got it at super speed. I'm going to add oil to that and then make it into paint so they can make a Paleolithic style cave painting. And I must say, I am so glad we decided to do this out on the porch, because once you add that oil to the paint, it looks good on the paper, but it actually seeps through quite a bit. So if you ever do try this at home, please go outside, or you're going to have a very oily wall. So Matt decided to paint a horse, and I think JR did a handprint, and so they had a lot of fun. It took much longer to make the paint than to actually do the painting, so that was kind of fun. That's all I have on narrative history for elementary students, and I thank you so much for coming to listen. I want to send you the message that you can do this. You can absolutely do this. You can teach history to your child. You're going to do a great job. It's going to be fine. There's so many resources available to help you. If you ever have any questions, you can usually find me at the History Quest Teachers Lounge Facebook group. It's a private group, so you have to request to join it, but if you search for it, you can find it. Or if you search under Pandia Press, I think you'll find it there as well. And I'm kind of hanging out there quite a bit, so I'm always happy to answer any questions about teaching history to the young ones. And I'd love to hear your questions right now as well. So thanks again.